So it's a very great pleasure to have the opportunity to present this work I've been involved with in the last for the last 2 years this evening. As Mairead said, we were both working together on a UK government-funded project, which unfortunately was prematurely curtailed. My lecture this evening looks at some issues related to that project, specifically children's work, but the sort of broad kind of point of departure for this work is the fact that, as you may be aware, the African continent has frequently been treated as a key site for formulating and testing a variety of models of humanitarian assistance, aid, investment, and economic development. And these models have a long and contentious history. Indeed, as is well known, European colonial rule in Africa was frequently justified in humanitarian and development terms. Indeed, the abolishment of slavery was harnessed, I'm talking about the transatlantic slave trade here, was harnessed in justifying colonial conquest on grounds that colonial rule would bring slavery to an end. And we also know that this self-proclaimed civilizing mission was characterized by patterns of violence, exploitation, and dispossession, the legacies of which are still persistent or present with us. And the blueprint for colonization was a story in which Africans and other colonized peoples were presented as backwards or uncivilized supplicants in need of rescue, religious salvation, and paternalistic protection by the European nations, which had appointed themselves as rescuers or civilizers. And critical scholarship today shows us that this fundamental framework and politics of paternalism has persisted to this day. It plays a foundational yet to overlooked role in many of the interventions in the global South by both governmental and non-governmental agencies and international organizations that are primarily located in or emanating from the Northern Hemisphere. And a key element of this enduring practice, and indeed the parallels between the historical and the contemporary, lies in rights and humanitarian campaigns and interventions, notable among which is efforts to address the issues presented as child labor, the worst forms of child labor, human trafficking, forced labor, and others discursively presented as modern day forms of slavery. A growing number of critics have challenged the rescue industry, which has emerged around this area of rights and humanitarian practices for their failure to take into account or indeed bring into focus any of the issues underpinning the sorts of problems that they seek to address. So people talk about the fact that modern day abolitionism overlooks issues to do with the legacies of enslavement, colonization, racial discrimination, unjust enrichment in the frame of global capitalism and its impacts on the poorest of the world, and all of these things which frankly are related to the issues which they seek to resolve. And so, as I said, my lecture this evening is going to address this concern through the focus on the rhetoric and strategies associated with the rescue industry or modern abolitionism, specifically looking at the activities of a non-governmental organization called the International Justice Mission, which has been partnering with the police service in Ghana and other officials to raid communities on the Lake Volta in that country in the name of rescuing children who have been purportedly trafficked or enslaved for fishing in these communities. As I argue, beneath this seeming just cause lies deeply problematic assumptions about childhood, children's labor mobility, emancipation, and freedom, which fail on their own terms, and which raise the question, which is above all of this, about whether there's a place for difference, particularly when it comes to the rights of indigenous communities in a globalizing world, whether indigenous communities are protected in a world where these sorts of practices are ongoing. So the starting point for this talk was in 2017 thereabouts, when I encountered headlines such as the one you see there on the screen. So the Member of Parliament for a place called the Afram Plains, north of Ghana, issued a press release and a statement on the floor of the Ghanaian Parliament, calling for the Speaker of Parliament to intervene in what she described as the abduction and illegal detention of approximately 144 children from communities in her constituency. Now, the MP was referring to an incident a few weeks earlier when armed police officers, in collaboration with operatives of the IJM, raided these riverine and island communities, in her words, and in those of the communities, to kidnap kids or to steal kids under the suspicion that these were children who had been enslaved or trafficked for fishing in those communities. Now, just by way of background, the IJM, for those who don't know about it, is a US-based, self-styled evangelical Christian organization founded in 1997. And I take some of this information here from its website. It's mainly focused on eliminating or abolishing human trafficking, forced prostitution, forced labor, and other issues classed as modern slavery. And so, as I stated earlier, the IJM, similar to other organizations, has positioned themselves in the continuing tradition of the 19th century abolitionist movement, with the, positioned themselves as actors seeking to free those who today they believe to be in modern or new forms of slavery. And its main strategy or mode of operation is raid and rescue, whereby they send volunteers, sometimes college students who have volunteered with the organization are sent into places of the world where they believe modern day slavery is still ongoing, or sometimes they work with local operatives to carry out covert surveillance and so on and so forth. And then they partner with local law enforcement agencies to raid these spaces to rescue, in their words, those they deemed to be victims, or to arrest traffickers, enslavers, or perpetrators of other crimes. Now, a striking thing about this organization is that much of its work takes place in the global south, whereas other scholars have observed, modern abolitionists believe that modern slavery is endemic due to backwards traditions, lack of sufficient development or civilization, and generally poor human rights records or interventions. And so it's within this context that in 2010, the IJM set up an office in Ghana to partner with the police and local law enforcement to address child trafficking and other issues which it has identified or it considers to be prevalent or endemic in the country. The organization's strategies, namely, as I said, has drawn a lot of, i.e. the strategy of raid and rescue has drawn criticism elsewhere, but nonetheless, that is its main mode of operation. So when my research collaborator, Kwame Ajiman, who was at the time at Lancaster University in Ghana, and I saw these news headlines, we were quite intrigued as to what had happened, and therefore wanted to explore this matter further. So we carried out an exploratory study with the islanders and riverine community residents to first of all understand the issue of raid and rescue from their viewpoints, bearing in mind that much of the existing debate is dominated by modern abolitionist organizations. Indeed, if you've got your PCs before you and you did a quick Google search for Volta child, you'd be struck at the fact that pretty much every news item that comes up on the search list is about child trafficking or something to do with something pejorative or negative in relation to children's rights or children's lives on these islands. And we were quite struck by that too. A lot of these relate to NGOs and media organizations. And we wanted to find out what these islanders themselves made of this kind of framework of reportage surrounding their community, but also what had transpired in these raids, which had compelled the IMP to call on the Speaker of Parliament for assistance. Particularly because our surprise was in part because we felt as a member of Parliament, she had a bit of clout, and the fact that she was calling on the Speaker of Parliament to help her contest actions by a non-governmental organization, obviously acting in partnership with the police, was a bit surprising to us. And so we carried out field work on the islands. There were 3 communities in question. The names are on the screen: Agodeke, Gazwekope, and Pala Islands. Interviewed community residents, and so this included leaders of the community, both traditional rulers and elected government officials. We interviewed children, siblings of the children who had been taken, and their parents and other residents as well on the issues which I explained or identified earlier. And due to time constraints, I'm going to jump right into some of the key issues that we unearthed from this research before commenting on them in relation to their significance or relevance to the issues of rights and humanitarianism and how they relate to matters of development and equality or inequalities and the historical aspects to them as well. Okay, so one of the things that really struck us in this project was a persistent reference to the white man with the camera when we spoke with the islanders. So we first of all asked those who had witnessed the raids, as they called it. Obviously, there is a contention as to whether these activities constitute rescue or raiding. For the islanders, their children, in their words, had been kidnapped and their communities had been raided. In the mainstream media reportage, this particular activity is described as rescue. And in fact, just before I go into the findings, of the 144 children who had been taken, this was back in 2017. After nearly a year of investigations, the MP reported as well that of the 144, it transpired that 140 had been wrongly taken from their parents while they were fishing or on the lake involved in other activities. So far from being children who had been stolen or trafficked or enslaved, these were children who were working with their families and had been taken. But the key issue which really struck us was the persistent reference to the white man with the camera by the islanders. By this reference, they were pointing out the fact that there was a gentleman whose ethnicity was white, who was unknown to them, who was recording the raiding of their villages or of their islands, or recording their children being taken away from them. So as you can see from quotes such as the one on the screen, some of them told us, we all saw him. He was in the other boat with the camera telling them what to do and recording them taking my son from me. This was from by a father. Similarly, another young boy we interviewed whose brother was taken said the same thing. He didn't actually know and it was a recording device, a camera, which was being used to capture the event. And likewise, we had another man, a grandfather, who also told us about so pretty much in all the narratives by those who were directly involved in the events of the children being taken away, that because they were present or they witnessed it, they spoke about the white man with the camera and kept asking us why he was recording them, because they didn't have any idea. And so in this project, we had to explain that one of the key uses of these sorts of recordings is NGO anti-trafficking advocacy. We explained to them that some of the footage captured in these recordings and in these activities are used by the IJM and other anti-trafficking organizations as a way of showcasing their work, showcasing the rescue of children from slavery or trafficking, as they describe it. And it was also quite striking to us because the islanders did not know. In fact, none of them had an idea about the ways in which these pictures and videos that are taken of them without consent are used, in part because these are very remote islands. I should have explained that earlier. So the islands were sort of very, very remote, and indeed none of them had electricity. So access to the internet and other media to see or find out these sorts of material was non-existent. But quite apart from that, it was also the case that none of the NGOs in question actually carry out any sort of advocacy or any work in relation to child trafficking on the islands themselves. So for these particular islands, indeed for some of them, the very first time they had seen or encountered a white person in their community was when this white man with the camera came with the police to, in their words, harass them and take their children away. And so that made it all the more striking for them. It stood out for them that this person who they had newly encountered was doing this, and therefore they wanted to find out why their children were being taken away. Not only that, but also how it transpired that you had this gentleman there with the camera recording them. So that was one of the main things that came out of this project, which was of interest to us, linking it to the ways in which historically Europeans and white Europeans, for that matter, have been in similar positions where indigenous communities have been at the receiving end of maltreatment, in which they happen to be involved. We saw striking similarities between the history or the historical and the contemporary. The other aspect of this particular case study is the violence of rescue. So in much of the NGO literature in relation to child trafficking, we find very kind of emollient, very anodyne, if you want, representations of this particular issue, where it's almost as if NGOs walk into indigenous communities where they believe children have been trafficked and the children are simply given away to them to rescue. And yet from this case study, it was obvious to us that it's a very violent activity. So the islanders informed us of, this is how the whole operation goes down. You have an islander who's on a boat with a child. In some cases, they've gone fishing. In some cases, these are islands. And so the islands are sort of the highway, is the playground, is the marketplace. Every social activity revolves around the lake. So some were traveling from one island to the other with their children in the boat. And then unexpectedly, they find speedboats with gun-toting men in it, with some with cameras, recording them, screaming at them, telling them to release their children to them. Obviously, this causes a lot of fear and panic. In some cases, the canoes in which the islanders were nearly capsized and stuff. Children screaming, clinging onto their parents for fear of these gun-toting people who were police officers, but obviously at that point, the islanders do not know that, and therefore clinging onto their parents in fear. And then, you have a tussle because in many cases, children don't want to leave their parents, understandably, to go into the boat being commandeered by the IJM and the police. And so a lot of force is used to pry them quite forcibly from the parents or the boats in which they are, where they resist, into the boats, and a lot of tears as well. Very, very traumatic indeed. And where the elders or the older people in the boat, refuse, again, understandably, because why would you comply with an order which you deem to be unjust if you are with your children and someone is trying to take them away because they think you have kidnapped your own children. In one case which really stood out to us, there was a 70-year-old man who was with his grandchild in the canoe. They'd gone to catch fish for the family, and his grandson refused to go into the boat, so he was clinging on to his grandfather, and the police very forcibly, violently yanked both of them from their canoe, threw them into their boat. The man's ribs were broken, 3 of them were broken, and he told us they were taken into a much larger boat, which was in the middle of the lake, where one of the white men, in the man's words, asked the police why they brought him. And they told him he was with one of the children, and therefore they thought he should be arrested. And the white man told them to take him back to the shore, which they did. So they deposited him at the lake shore with no treatment or no attention for his ribs, which they had broken in the process of rescuing, purportedly, his own grandchildren. So it's a very violent activity, which is in stark contrast to images like what you see on the screen there, which is almost as if you've got, someone enticing children with gifts, because that is the way in which the rescue operation takes place. But the reality, we argue, is far from that. It's a very traumatic experience, not only the violence of the rescue operation itself, but in this particular episode, you had over 140 children who were detained by the Ghanaian authorities at the behest of the IJM for nearly a year while the investigations were ongoing, and were denied access to their parents. And for one of the parents we interviewed, he said one of the police officers who were involved in the case himself found it so distressing that he used to call him to tell him his children are crying and asking for him every day, because obviously they want to be with their parents. They don't want to be at this supposed shelter, which is another term which the IJM and the authorities use. But, obviously for the children, that is no shelter at all. It's more or less a prison. So that's another of the issues here. And again, you can see similarities between the history of interventions in the Global South in the era of colonization, where in a lot of countries, Ghana included, you had the introduction of boarding schools, which began as a means of civilizing supposed uncivilized. So it was all about trying to introduce new patterns of family organization, to teach families how to live properly, to be good subjects of freedom, if you want, by taking their children away from them, placing them in boarding schools and other institutions where they will be taught new behaviors and new traditions and new ways of living, which were different to those of their parents. And there are similarities between these institutions and the shelters where children are being taken under the context of rescue and, being placed today. But added to this, we can also see again in the footsteps of the era of colonization, the sorts of civilizing missions under which colonization occurred, the sorts of assumptions which underpin these so-called rescue missions that are being undertaken in Ghana and elsewhere in the global south. Because we found that there was a marked dissonance, first of all, between the understandings of childhood and child rights and child wrongs articulated in, say, the Ghana Child Rights Act and in international conventions such as the UNCRC and in literature used by NGOs such as the IJM, vis-a-vis those held by people living on the islands. And this is the point I was making earlier about where we square the circles that exist, the differences between how indigenous communities, such as those which live on these remote islands, consider as appropriate child upbringing, and those which the Ghanaian government has, taken on in the context of international development and international child rights practices, and sort of trying to assimilate with these as well. Because for most of our participants, there is no deviance or anomaly associated with the parent taking the child on the lake. The lake is their heritage as they see it. And indeed, there are three main sources of employment on these islands where the research was taken out during the time of our, where the research, took place, farming, charcoal burning, and fishing. So my doctorate degree, I was saying jokingly to my research collaborator, is pointless in that community because I would starve if I lived there and I didn't know how to fish, how to work on the land, or how to produce charcoal. So in that particular context, people deem it really important to teach their children how to work in these capacities. From infancy, one must learn how to swim for starters, and once you know how to swim, you introduce to things like how to paddle the canoes and eventually how to catch fish, because that is how you become self-sufficient. And indeed, these remote islands have lived self-sufficiently, given that they have been marginalized from governmental social welfare, social support programs. In fact, apart from a very dilapidated school on one of the islands, there aren't any schools, no hospitals, there's no governmental presence at all. And in fact, for many of the islands, again, the very first time they had any encounter with the police was when their villages and communities were raided. So it's very striking that you had an NGO able to commandeer a unit of the Ghanaian police to raid these islands when the islanders themselves have no recourse to justice when crimes occur, because access to police and other support of that nature is virtually non-existent. But the main point I was making is that for these islanders, knowing how to fish or teaching a child how to fish from anything from 3-4 years up to age 12 before the child enters teenagehood is very important. On the other hand, you have policymakers, NGOs, and others who see children's work in fishing as a violation of the child's rights. And that is the context in which these raids are taking place. So the Ghana Child Rights Act, for instance, makes it a criminal offense for a child to be found on a lake. Indeed, any fishing activity which is which involves a child in Ghana is illegal. That is the striking thing again from this. And this has in part come about because of the kinds of rhetoric and discussions around children's work in fishing in the country, where the mainstream discourse, as I pointed out, if you Google children fishing Ghana, just those 3 words, you'll find a very pathological sort of representation of it. So while a child here in the UK is able to go cast a net or whatever with their parent as a kind of pastime. A child doing the same in Ghana by virtue of the sorts of pressures brought to bear on the Ghanaian government to do something about child trafficking in the fishing sector. A child who does that with their parent is living, indeed involved rather, in a criminal activity. So the point here is that somehow, despite the fact that these communities are so remote and far removed from information on national laws, from governmental social welfare interventions and all of these, they are still somehow expected to know that their ways of life, or what they deem to be virtual child upbringing practices, are criminalized or an affront to children's dignity, well-being, and rights. And this is a very serious issue when you live in a community where fishing is the mainstay, or the sole means through which one can be able to take care of themselves in the absence of other viable alternatives. And so the third point that I've been trying to really bring to bear is that the last 2 decades has witnessed a step change in the portrayal of children's work generally, and this relates to all manner of labor and employment, because the formation and entry of contemporary slavery abolitionist organizations into the child rights arena has catapulted, propelled conversations on these activities from the arena of child labor, which is how they were described barely 10 years ago when you think about it, into the arena of child trafficking and child slavery. So a child fishing on the lake is no longer seen in terms of child labor, but it is presented as a form of child slavery. And it's within this context that the IJM and others have set their sights on these communities. And a major source for the IJM's power, which I talk about in a forthcoming paper, because indeed I say that a lot of these organizations have been empowered in ways which make them a threat even to the very sovereignty of relatively poor countries such as Ghana. Because a major source of the power enjoyed by the IJM and others is the US Trafficking in Persons rankings, which is a foreign policy tool used by the US government to assess and rank nations based on how well they are considered to be doing, in terms of addressing human trafficking and others. And in 2016, the US government placed Ghana on a tier 2 watch list as a country that was supposedly not doing enough to address child trafficking or human trafficking, and therefore faced sanctions to the tune of several $100 million if things did not improve. And so the government was therefore compelled to comply with a number of actions at the risk of not being seen to be doing enough. And one of these actions is playing ball with organizations such as the IJM, which receives much of its funding from the US Labor Department and the US Justice Department and others. Indeed, the IJM is worth over $60 million. And in some of the assessments that have been made on the funding given by US agencies to the IJM and others to show the work they're doing across the world, some of the raids that are being carried out are funded by the IJM. The fuel boats and cars and others, which the police use for these operations. So the point here is that the IJM is empowered in ways that enable it, as I said earlier, to commandeer the police and direct its activities in the areas where we did the fieldwork, as our research participants told us. So while the IJM says on its website that it accompanies the police in a kind of observatory role and records things and stuff, our islanders were adamant that the white man with the camera and his friends were the ones directing the capture of their children, their dehumanization in the violence that ensued, And in the case of the old man, he said it was the white man on the boat who told the police to take him back to the lake shore. So the point is that they are structurally empowered in ways which really make them a threat to the rights and freedoms of rural, marginalized, and indigenous populations whose ways of life are seen to be non-compliant with the models of childhood, the models of freedom that are promoted by the IJM and others. And so as I bring my presentation to an end, I argue here that there's a real tension today between the rights of indigenous communities and the sorts of actions that are ongoing. The IJM's practices and rhetoric through which it presents itself as an emancipator, benevolent agent of freedom, hides the fact that it's also an agent of oppression and unfreedom. And Padma Govindan has discussed this work when she argues that through the theater of raid and rescue, the IJM's activities and the vision of liberation, which it promotes, has significant implications for how we think about the political and ethical dimensions of contemporary humanitarian interventions and anti-trafficking interventions by drawing on commonly held assumptions about the nature of freedom and slavery. Bodies such as the IJM are able to suture concerns about the serious harms associated with their work, and instead, I think that they flatten or make it difficult for people to see what are really complex issues relating to rights, freedom. You know, they flatten these issues into simple matters of victims and perpetrators, rescuers and enslavers, or enslavers and liberators. So the politics, or is vision of liberation for children in the area where we did our research and elsewhere in the global south, and its effectiveness in pursuing this vision, I say, make bodies such as the IJM, I use the IJM here, but I think this is broadly related to the wider humanitarian field, make this field a crucial site for looking at larger questions about the meanings attached to childhood, mobility, slavery, freedom, and rights, and linking this to the historical, the fact that catching children is seen as a way of freeing or rescuing them, completely devoid of any of the sorts of historical issues related to the position of Ghana itself, the fact that Ghana as a country is today still reliant on the sorts of support or aid of Western government and other donors is completely missing. And the reasons why this is so is completely missing from the sorts of interventions that are promoted by the agents or agencies in question. But there's also a class dimension here, primarily because the IJM is not the only operative here. We're talking about the Ghana Police Service, which, is, I think you could argue, while the Ghanaian government is in a sense forced to comply, because by not doing enough, by not playing ball with the IJM and others, it will be seen as not doing enough to end child trafficking, where again, you've got the perverse scenario where anti-trafficking organizations supply information to the US government, and it is this information which is used to create the TIP, or the Trafficking in Persons Report. So again, we see how anti-trafficking organizations are empowered to be judges and juries and executioners, because they go into the field to look at these issues. They determine what is classed as trafficking or not. They call on governments to act, and they supply or report on the actions or inactions of the government in question. So a government which pushes back against the ways in which the NGO in question is promoting or executing its activity, can be reported as not doing, enough, and therefore find itself in trouble. So we can see again how this is very much in the sort of framework of the paternalistic interventions which pervaded or which underpinned colonialism, in the way which, while governments are meant to be sovereign and stand for the rights of their citizens, in this context, the police and other agents are pushed in ways which make them brutalize their own, indigenous communities, rather than promote them or work with them in other ways that can bring about a more sort of collaborative approach to child rights and human rights. I'm going to end here and hopefully address your questions in the next 5-10 minutes or so. But thank you very much for your attention.